Hello and welcome to this edition of Beyond Our Voices. Now, over the last while, we've been talking about the power of telling your story and the emotions that come with it, and even focusing on some of the emotions. Now, today we're going to be talking about shame, one of the most debilitating of the emotions. We're going to talk shame, let's talk about it. Now, the reason we came up with the title is because our very special guest today is Desiree-Anne Martin, who wrote a book called We Don't Talk About It Ever. And this is her story of it's her memoir. It's a story of terrible abuse. In fact, let's just talk about it. Desi, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Tracy.
This is quite a story. I mean, on the cover here you say, a girl who searched for love but found destruction instead. It was a very destructive journey, and it started very young, at about 4, didn't it?
Yeah, it started about the age of 4. My earliest recollection, well, one was my 4th birthday party, but the other one was of being abused sexually by a family friend, a male family friend. And that search for love was because I was born into an exceptionally dysfunctional family of origin. And I constantly needed to either get attention or get love through attention, or what I landed on when I was about 4 was that I needed to be a good girl in order to be loved, whatever that meant at the time.
And then slowly but surely you became the bad girl, and it was, I mean, you were quite remarkable. You were an A student, you went to drama school, you won all the awards, you were fabulous. and then of course it all started going pear-shaped, and then you started, I suppose, at the warm and fuzzy feeling of the first drugs and the deterioration, and eventually you ended actually up on the streets, didn't you?
I did. Well, I was living with my mother, but I was sleeping in elevators and doorways, and when I vowed that I'd never drink alcohol because of witnessing my father's alcoholism, but when I did at 17 for the first time, it felt like coming home, and it addressed every single insecurity that I had about myself. And yes, I excelled at sport, and yes, I excelled academically, but underneath all of that, there's such a brittle sense of self-esteem. And that's how I did search for love, In my adolescence, though, I did try the negative attention thing, because the positive attention thing wasn't really working for me. So I tried the negative, and I was this rebel without a cause.
That's right, wearing black Doc Martens,
Doc Martens,
bad attitude.
Like pseudo-goth, pseudo-anything anyone wanted me to be, because the search was still about...
You became this complete chameleon.
I was, and thank you to the theatre school for training me. And that's why I fell in love with drama, because it was pure escapism, and I was exceptionally good at it because it allowed me to become anything and anyone I wanted to be except myself, because I found myself intolerable. I found the pain that I was experiencing and the intense emotions completely intolerable. So books, escapism, acting, escapism, just anything just to get me away from my own reality. And then when alcohol and drugs came along, I was like, bingo, we got it. I could live in altered states for like 3 days at a time, and then...
So this journey is of course all of that, and then picking up the pieces of your life and sitting here today as a registered counsellor, as somebody who goes out there and helps somebody else. So I wanted to talk about shame, because actually when I read the book, I was... there were times where I thought, whoa, this is very honest. I mean, you were remarkably honest in this. You really exposed yourself. You showed all your flaws. You didn't pretend that you were better than anything other than who you were. I mean, that was quite remarkable. There's right in the beginning of the book, you talk about being highly sexualized and highly stimulated as an individual. And of course, that individual was 4 years old.
Yeah.
And as I read that part, I mean, I, as a reader, I felt your shame, and even when I approached you to talk about shame as a subject, I thought about things that had happened in my own life, and I thought about the shame. And even then, I sit in the heat. I can feel my cheeks going, red from the shame, even all these years later. And when I read your story, and I thought, this shame has already been set in you at the tender age of 4.
Yes.
So let's talk shame. What is shame?
Well, I'd like to, if I can, just talk about the spectrum of feelings that live within this world of shame. So we have embarrassment. So embarrassment is kind of that feeling that you feel when you are worried about what other people think of you. And that is connected to wanting to fit in, and that's a basic human need, to belong. So when we do something stupid like slip or say something awkward and we feel embarrassed, it's based on an external projection of what we think other people are thinking of us. And the embarrassment is like, I don't belong, I'm awkward, I'm different, I'm stupid, and then we've got guilt. So just put simply, the emotion of guilt, all emotions exist to tell us something. They're like little alarm sensors informing us of the world that we're experiencing. And guilt tells us that we made a mistake. So I hurt you, I made a mistake. Guilt says that wasn't okay, I made a mistake. And then if it motivates me to then correct that behavior, then guilt has served its purpose. But people hold on to guilt, and guilt feeds. If it doesn't motivate change, it can just linger and you can sit in that guilt. But it's actually quite a futile feeling after feeling it. And then there's shame. So while guilt says, I made a mistake, shame says, I am a mistake. Okay? And
so shame is about self and self-identity.
Absolutely. So guilt is external, embarrassment is external, but shame is an internal process. And I can use myself as an example. I struggled, not sure, with toxic shame. And what that is literally layer upon layer of poisonous shame. But
doesn't that start in childhood?
Absolutely. So every child yearns and deserves to be uniquely loved by their parents, their guardians, their caregivers, whoever that might be. And through either verbal or non-verbal messages that are sent by our caregivers, we are told that we're either not good enough, or that we are a failure, or that we are, this is my case, that not perfect enough, not good enough. And that's where that shame sets in. And that becomes the narrative, and that became my narrative. So I felt that I was just never good enough in any circumstance, which is why I excelled at stuff, because I needed to be perfect to be loved. And then when that didn't work, I was like, well, I'm going to go the other way. I'm just going to self-destruct. But it was the shame of my identity. I felt like a fraud. I had huge imposter syndrome. That chameleon thing was just about wanting to belong and wanting, but inside I was like, and what
I'm
shame
worthless.
tells us is that if people knew who I really was, they wouldn't love me or wouldn't like me. And that is the big lie, that shame. And toxic shame is then you get those messages that are kind of entrenched in childhood, and then more things happen, or you create more experiences based on that narrative to then reinforce that shame, and then layer upon layer. And in my case, and I'll talk about my sexual abuse, is that I didn't speak about my sexual abuse when I was 4 because I was a good girl.
I don't think you have the words at 4 anyway. In fact, most of us sit here as adults, we don't even have the words.
But recently I had this experience where I wrote about, because I recalled in detail that when I wrote that book, I didn't have a recollection, but subsequently, yay, I have recalled in detail that experience. And I remember thinking at the time, is this love? Then maybe this is love. So that kind of set a new narrative, that offering myself up as a victim to abuse, which I did many times throughout my life without saying anything about it, because I thought I deserved it. Because I thought maybe that is love, that kind of sexual attention, that kind of sexual abuse, sexual assault, just inappropriate sexual kind of
I can't imagine how that that skewers the way you think of love. If at 4 years old you're being sexually abused by an uncle in the family, I mean, how do you recover from it? How have you recovered from it? Have you recovered from it? Okay, you wrote this book.
I felt compelled to write that book, and yes, it is brutally honest because this is my story. I inherited this legacy from my family without my consent of secrets and lies and shame. And when it came to writing this book, I was like, I have to break the cycle. I absolutely have to break the cycle for my daughters. You know, I refuse to pass this on to them. And I have a teenage daughter and a little thing, bundle of, TNT. And so I had to write it. And, you know, I did go to some really dark places there. There are things that I needed to recall. And I have an insanely memory, and I didn't want to recall some of the things that I did and some of the things that I wrote about. And I was privileged enough to have the support of saying, like, to people, I need to process this because I've written an entire chapter about my rape, but I don't think I've ever processed it. And so after the book, I realized that, like, things started to land intellectually, like, it wasn't my fault. Very simple, you know? It wasn't my fault. And the entire time I thought it had been. But that was an intellectual process. And a couple of months ago, it actually landed emotionally. And I felt, for the first time, authentically, that none of it was my fault.
So it's a process. So even written the book, and you're a counsellor, you've studied this, and still, even long after, I mean, this book's been out for about 2 years already, isn't it? 3 years.
3 years.
So even now you're still processing it.
I'm still processing it, but so everything was on this intellectual level, and I thought, you know, I've written this book, I've let it go. No. And because the toxic shame is very insidious, you know, it doesn't want to let go. It's like new Velcro, you know, and so it kept this narrative going of, like, not being good enough and needing to be better and feeling the shame. And there are lots of things that accompany toxic shame. You can even get shame anxiety, which is the fear of feeling shame. Which is something that I experience, you know. And sometimes you kind of flash and stuff.
I do. You know, even sitting here last week, as I say, typing up the letter saying, Daisy, please, you know, can we talk about shame? I just felt myself like...
but it's only when, actually, prior to the book, I came into recovery almost 17 years ago. And it was at that treatment center, actually, that I rediscovered the power of speaking my truth. Because I came in with so much shame. I'd been a sex worker. I'd been an intravenous heroin addict. I'd committed most crimes, sans murder, just to be clear. But so much shame.
So aside from the toxic shame which had been put onto you as a child, suddenly you've also added the layers of shame yourself, and
Absolutely.
then you have to take responsibility for that as well.
Because my narrative informs that I get myself into these situations, and it's like this cycle, and it's got, and then I got to this treatment center, and I started speaking my truth for the first time in my life, and there was no judgment, and there's no retribution. And people were saying, yes, this happened to me too. And I was like, what? Okay, so I get to come into this space where I get to become authentic, which is a long process, but for the first time, I wasn't shamed for my shame, if that makes sense.
Now, you've written a book. You've been given the opportunity to sit in your feelings, whichever emotions they are. We've just identified shame for today. But most people are not going to write a book. So how do people process their shame?
I can only speak to as a counsellor.
Yeah.
You know, and processing shame is trauma work. There's hardly ever shame without trauma attached to it. And even if it wasn't the messages that we were sent as children, there was some predisposing traumatic event that set off this chain, this narrative of shame. And it is about going back to these places, you know, and identifying how did this experience make me have the relationship I do with myself and others. And what shame wants to do, it wants to keep us in the secrecy. And there's a slogan in the 12-step fellowships about secrets keep you sick. And also shame dies in exposure, which are two catchphrases that I love because that's what happens. But there is never shame without trauma. And it can be something as insidious, as I wrote in my book, as, you know, my uncle exposing my underwear. That is actually sexual trauma. For a 6-year-old, it is. Because I remember thinking, that's my fault. It's my fault for wearing dresses. Right up until what we call, like complex trauma. But shame is always connected to some kind of unprocessed experience, but that experience is so powerful that it dictates how we are in the world and how we relate to ourselves in the world.
So as a counsellor, just to sort of end off our session, what is the first step in processing shame? What would be the first thing you say to someone who comes to you and says, I can't cope with my shame?
I say congratulations, because the first step is actually asking for help. Asking for help is the scariest but most courageous thing that anyone can do. And it doesn't have to be a therapist. It can just be somebody, a confidant, a friend, a trusted adult, if it's a young child or an adolescent. And when they get past the process of saying that they actually need the help, then it's about creating a safe space for them to, and it doesn't need to be the privileged space of a therapeutic, session. It's just a safe space and a non-judgmental space where slowly, very slowly, people can start to speak their truth.
Desi, I can't thank you enough for coming in today and being with us, and thank you very much. So if anyone hasn't read the book, this is it. Desiree-Anne Martin, we don't talk about it ever. It's a harrowing story, and perhaps if you're feeling shame or if you're feeling guilt or if you're just trying to process your very own story, I would recommend this book just to actually evoke those emotions and to really sit and think about, your own life. So Desi, thank you very much, but I do want to give you our beautiful T-shirt, which we give to all of our guests, because Picasso, the painting pig, did a once-off logo for us. And so you've got your T-shirt. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
And yes, thank you very much. So join us next time when we talk here on Beyond Our Voices. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.